Hello and welcome back to Blame Theory, the podcast where we take a seriously playful look at the ideas that have shaped our minds and our world and perhaps misshapen them, and to ask how we've ended up here and whom or what we can blame. I'm joined by my colleague Nina Power. How's it going, Nina?
Very well, Geoff, thank you.
So today we're talking about one of the biggest objects and targets of these kinds of blame theory narratives of the past half century or so, and that is Michel Foucault, who, as it happens, died just about 40 years ago in June 1984. So we're coming up on the 4-decade anniversary of his death. And so we thought it would be a good time to confront his legacy head on and confront the various narratives that have emerged around it. So I think you can find Foucault being blamed plenty by probably most notably figures from the right, cultural conservatives. Also, I would say sort of figures from the liberal center or sort of liberal center to right center, particularly around his kind of epistemic relativism and critiques of knowledge. And finally, I think you also have a blame narrative from the left, which generally comes from more traditionally minded materialist Marxists, which sees Foucault uh, as a kind of traitor to leftist commitments to again sort of material and economic analysis, who sort of pushes the left towards identitarian concerns. So these are, I'd say, the three broad narratives that you tend to find. I think we'll focus mostly on the first and second today, and then perhaps get into the more kind of left-wing critiques of Foucault in a future follow-up episode. So to start off, I think Nina dug up a few instances of this type of blame narrative, just to kind of give a sense of what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess it should be noted, seeing as we're focusing on the first volume of the history of sexuality, that Foucault's own sexuality, and obviously he says that this term and this way of viewing things is a relatively specific invention. But there are two kind of main aspects to this. I think, first of all, I suppose the accusation of his own behavior as immoral in relation to the AIDS crisis, and the idea that Foucault, who was one of the, I guess, quite prominent people to die quite early on in the crisis of HIV and associated illnesses, um, that his own behavior in the bathhouses was sort of, uh, you know, immoral and kind of irresponsible and hedonistic and so on. And then I suppose just to note, in 2021, there was the accusation by a French intellectual called Guy Saumon that he had visited Foucault in Tunisia during the 60s, and that Foucault had engaged in predatory payment of young boys for sex in a graveyard. This accusation has been widely discussed, but the reason I raise it, I suppose, is to bring those two things into a broader pattern of what we've seen as a kind of moral condemnation of thinkers on the basis of their individual behaviour, which has kind of been part and parcel of the Great Awakening. We've seen people turn against generally male writers, thinkers, artists, and so on the basis that their personal behaviour undermines, or indeed somehow possibly even refutes in some cases, their other output, and that these things, these accusations, whether they're proven or not, are in a sense a reason enough, I suppose, not to read people anymore. But to get back to the kind of usual blaming Foucault as a thinker, some kind of classic examples we encounter as indeed a sort of bearer of postmodernism, people writing on Twitter or X. I encounter an almost magical belief that changing words and discourse will change reality. I blame Foucault. It's kind of a classic. Uh, Again, changing language as a substitute for changing the world. I blame Foucault. So that this idea that any discussion of discourse is in itself a sort of reification of discourse, right? So this is a classic intellectual problem we encounter, where someone might be diagnosing something, and in their diagnosis is somehow being accused of promoting it or defending it as a position. So, again, we're always in this kind of very complicated, ambiguous grey zone when we're thinking about intellectual history and the impact of ideas, about the relationship between kind of diagnosis and promulgation, something like this. But I think to focus on History of Sexuality, Volume 1, which is probably up there with the most widely read Foucault, certainly volume 1, maybe alongside Discipline and Punish. Um, Maybe if we go, before we get into the deeper questions of where we might, in fact, assign blame in our playful, serious way to Foucault, and it's not always in the same way that the right or the left or the centre might in popular discourse. So I agree with Geoff that we have seen this kind of turn, this kind of doubling down, tripling down on Foucault as the bearer of many things that are wrong. If we could just outline the main hypotheses or the claims made in Volume 1, which is from 1976 in the original French.
Yeah, so History of Sexuality, Volume 1, I would definitely agree is the most widely read and assigned in courses. I'm not sure if this is as much the case in the UK, but certainly in the US, in all kinds of intro courses on, uh, for example, any kind of literary cultural theory, cultural studies, gender and sexuality studies, queer studies, all these kinds of things. This would be a kind of one of the canonical texts that would be assigned, along with, say, Gender Trouble by Judith Butler, who we discussed previously. And as evidence of this, if you go to a used bookstore in any college town or neighborhood, you'll find many copies of this History of Sexuality, Volume 1, sitting around. Uh, and that's just, generally evidence that they're assigned to like first or second year university students and read in that context. So it does, it has that kind of reach. I think Discipline and Punish, as you said, is probably the other one that has a similar kind of tendency to be assigned very widely. And so one question worth asking is, given that it does have that kind of reach, how much has it actually penetrated the culture? How much has its basic argument really disseminated? So one part of the argument that you certainly find in here is the infamous notion of power knowledge, right? That I think is evidence of the way that Foucault is very much a student of Nietzsche, who we've also discussed previously. The way that he thinks of power in this kind of ontological sense, as this sort of pervasive substance, rather than something that can be just be localized in certain institutional spaces. Is very much evidence of the way that he drew from Nietzsche's kind of account of power and the will to power as this kind of fundamental and kind of transhistorical and kind of socially pervasive fundamental that can be used to account for all manner of relationships and social phenomena. And so power knowledge is I think most widely derived from the account Foucault gives of it in this book, and certainly does seem to have had a wide impact. And in terms of blame narratives, it's worth noting that a few years ago, the short-lived prior to her short-lived stint as prime minister of your country, Nina, Liz Truss, at the time trade minister,
Our
gave a
great
speech.
intellectual, Liz Truss.
Yes, who is now being invited to various American sort of conservative gatherings and being given top billing, and I believe has a book out. But in any case, she gave a speech about the British education system, in which she blamed postmodern philosophy, as she put it, which she described as uh, pioneered by Foucault, right? And she described postmodernist philosophy as it's sort of been disseminated in the educational system as putting societal power structures and labels ahead of individuals and their endeavors. In this school of thought, there is no space for evidence. There is no objective view. Truth and morality is all relative. So, in other words, the interpretation of this notion of power knowledge is that Truss is relaying here is that what it means is that there's no objective knowledge, there's no objective standard. Everything is just about power relations, and so you know this undermines the education by saying that that what you're taught in school is just a reflection of the will to power of some group over the other groups that they're attempting to dominate, something along these lines, and therefore there's no objective knowledge, no possibility of objective knowledge, because knowledge is just a kind of pretext for power relations. That's kind of the interpretation here. And then the other one that I think I don't have a specific citation, but I think I've seen, which I find maybe a bit more persuasive actually, is if we think about the sort of Me Too era and the immense concern about power differentials in relationships at the kind of micro level of how humans interact in sort of intimate settings. And here, ironic aside, Foucault, of course, is in a sense kind of posthumously Me Too'd through this accusation of sort of
Mhm.
pederasty, of basically frequenting sort of underage boy prostitutes in Tunisia. Now, interestingly, this is coming from a French intellectual of the right, and it's largely circulated by figures on the right, and is now repeated as if it's sort of a proven accusation. It's actually not really proven. It's just kind of an anecdote of dubious authenticity. But it's also true that I mean, what we do know is that Foucault did, along with a number of other prominent French intellectuals of his generation, sign petitions, demanding the elimination of essentially age of consent restrictions on sex in France. So that's a whole other story. Point being, he was involved in these debates, and in a way that would be regarded by many progressives today as problematic, right? In his seeming to not believe that there was any problem with age gaps as we talk about them today. But what I'm another kind of blame narrative that I think is like at least somewhat persuasive is at least this popularized idea of power knowledge and of power as kind of operating at every level of society, and there being
Yeah.
power relations enacted at every level that he makes very clear and explicit in History of Sexuality. It does seem to have some kind of genealogical relationship to how people started talking about sex and sex relations. I think initially on campuses where you had these attempts to create these very formal like consent uh, documents that you had to sign in order for your sexual interactions to be regarded as uh, non-violating. But then this kind of spilled out into the broader culture. So I don't know. I mean, do you think there's something there as well, like that
It's
this kind of
interesting.
way he talks about power
Yeah,
does end up seeping out into the culture?
I think so, although clearly not in the way he might have intended. I mean, I think it's interesting that even quite a while ago, feminists were picking up on bits in Foucault which they regarded as a bit dodgy, right? And there are lines in History of Sexuality, Volume 1, where he kind of says, I'll just read you one, for example, where he says, it is true that a long standing freedom, in inverted commas, of language between children and adults, or pupils and teachers, may have disappeared, and the boisterous laughter that had accompanied the precocious sexuality of children for so long, and in all social classes, it seems, was gradually stifled. And there's a kind of sadness in Foucault's language when he talks about, for example, like the village idiot having some kind of sexual encounter with a peasant girl, in this sort of bucolic, sort of
Yes.
retro
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
fetish. But I think your point. I agree. I've had this thought actually that this model of the diffuse notion of power, such that power, and he's very clear, and I think this was a kind of great move. You have to hand it to Foucault in some ways, where he starts talking about a non-monarchical and non-legal conception of power, right? Like precisely in this Nietzschean way, power is diffuse, power is everywhere. I mean, this is not incorrect. I mean, the Marxist critique of Foucault is therefore somehow undermining and smashing the kind of Marxist conception of class is also true. But on some level, what Foucault is pointing to is something that we are all dimly aware of at every point. And he's right that the teaching of history that focuses primarily on a kind of top-down notion of sovereignty, or that the law, that crime is simply what the law says it is, and power is simply punishment from above, or that kind of thing. He's of course right, especially in the age of surveillance, and this is something that Deleuze and others were also working in, the transition of power itself from visible punishment. This is more in discipline and punish, but to an age of surveillance and much more subtle notions of coercion. He's really talking about something very clever, and I think that the real question in volume one is how this power, knowledge, pleasure, and this redescription of power as non-monarchical, non-legal fits with the early, well, both other main claims, one of which is the critique of the repressive hypothesis, which I'll ask you about in a second, and the other of which we must discuss is the turn at the end to the right of death over power, the right of death and power over life, which is taken up in the discussion of biopower, biopolitics, populations by Giorgio Agamben and others. And so there's a really, for a short book, there's an awful lot going on here, much of which is extremely influential in all kinds of directions. So, but maybe if we just start with the repressive hypothesis, or rather Foucault's critique of the repressive hypothesis, and then come back to questions of discourse, power, and then population.
Absolutely. So yeah, and in some ways, I think this is maybe the least. I mean, again, I think the thesis about the diffuseness of power, the notion that, and, to quote, there is no binary and all encompassing opposition between rulers and ruled at the root of power relations. No such duality extending from the top down. One must suppose rather the manifold relationships of force that take shape and come into play in the machinery of production in families, limited groups, are the basis for wide-ranging effects of cleavage that run through the social body as a whole. So that's, kind of a quote that captures, I think, this sense of power that did, in a sense, leak out and become widely accepted, which I think can account for at least the kind of framework by which certain um, new ideas about sex, right? That actually, you have to think about the power relations involved in every sort of sexual and potential and actual sexual encounter, right? Like you think about this short story Cat Person, which was sort of central to this discussion, where it's like, okay, I mean, is in a way part of the question it poses is like, okay, one of them's a college student, the other's this kind of slightly older guy who like works a minimum wage job. Can there be understood to be some kind of power relations obtaining in this relationship, which I think goes to something you've written about, Nina, which is this kind of siblingification, where everyone is conceived of as needing to kind of stand on this sort of horizontal axis towards each other, and so sort of vertical relations are already stigmatized and seen as problematic. So I think this is a kind of mutation of Foucault's analysis in a sense. Now, I think a few things to note here. One, we this is often talked about as like one of the strands of a kind of new sex negativity that's come into play in the past sort of 10 or so years, where There are different versions of this, right? But that's the idea of a sexual free for all that's sort of unleashed through the sexual revolution, suddenly kind of comes under suspicion from various quarters and for various reasons. But one is that it would seem to neglect the idea that there are still power relations being enacted, and that the idea of sexual freedom is actually problematic because we're constrained in all these ways through these kind of micro level power relations that are uh, acting diffusely across every even seemingly trivial interaction, right? And so I suppose what's interesting here is this sort of brings us back to the repressive hypothesis, which Foucault is framing this book as well as the entire series of books that it initiates as a kind of critique of the dominant narrative about sexuality that he believes has sort of taken hold by the later 20th century, which is a post-sexual revolution narrative, right? And so, just to quote the very beginning of the book, he says, "For a long time, the story goes, we supported a Victorian regime, and we continue to be dominated by it even today. Thus, the image of the imperial prude is emblazoned on our restrained, mute, and hypocritical sexuality." And then, um, basically, he goes on to argue that, there's this, and I think, he's writing this in the late 70s, early 80s. So it's clearly a post-sexual revolution reflection. And part of what he's responding to is that there continues to be this idea that, okay, well, the sexual revolution has happened in a few different phases, but like we're still not liberated enough, right? This kind of Victorian prudery continues to constrain us, and we need to keep, freeing ourselves from it and keep this process of sexual liberation going, right? And perhaps surprisingly, because I think at least the conservative take on Foucault would be that he was himself a hedonist. Even if we don't take seriously the Sormont accusation specifically, he clearly was somebody who enjoyed hanging out in bathhouses. There's a notable discussion of this at the beginning of James Miller's biography, the Passion of Michel Foucault, which really frames his entire career around his interest in sadomasochism and other kinds of sort of extreme limit experiences of eroticism. And so we might think, okay, he was somebody who was part of this move towards liberation, towards the freeing up of sexuality and the destigmatization of these types of practices, of what we came to call kink. And so he interestingly is actually framing this entire book as a critique of this whole narrative, right? In which essentially he argues that the notion of a kind of Victorian prudery and repression from which Western civilization had to escape in order to liberate itself from these neuroses in the psychoanalytic account, that this is a kind of myth, right, that has arisen, and
Yeah.
that the purpose of what he's doing here is to offer a kind of counter narrative, um, in which he questions the idea that Western society ever was, in fact,
Mhm.
repressed, right? Or that sexuality was repressed. And in fact, argues on the contrary that the entire discourse of sexuality, from the origins of sort of the modern West, has been this, what he calls this incitement to discourse about sex, right? That in
Yeah.
fact, far from being repressed, much of what was being much of what is has was being interpreted as repressive was in fact a kind of incitement, right? Was the opposite of repression, that it was in fact producing the discourse about sexuality, and by the same stroke, and again this is power knowledge at work, was in fact producing sexuality itself as we know it in some sense, right?
Yeah,
um
exactly, like
and
these process of classification and so on, yeah. So just a bit more on the discourse point. Yeah, I mean, there's a great quote says, what actually happens is the multiplication of discourses concerning sex in the field of the exercise of power itself. And um, why do we say with so much passion that we are repressed, right? Like that there's something kind of performatively contradictory about this endless discussion about how repressed we are. And I think that in the age of the internet, it's very interesting to think about the use of the term discourse, right? Like this is something that people invoke constantly as the sort of fleeting, flowing moment in whatever is being discussed, which in fact is often the relationships between men and women. um, if you look at X on any given day, there'll be millions of people, or at least hundreds of thousands, engaging in kind of discussions about what men are like, what women are like, how men and women get along or how they don't, or, classic war of the sexes stuff, whether you have kind of advice about how to sort of manipulate women into having sex with you or whatever. It's just this kind of endless discussion about sex, and and people refer to it as the discourse. And it's exactly in a way what Foucault says. It's this kind of sex itself has become discourse, or he talks about discourse instead of sex, like the discourse on sex. I mean, we don't have to go as far as Lacan and say that discourse is sex, but we could say that this proliferation of discourses, the multiplication of discourses, is precisely a kind of revealing of how there has never been any repression, if you see what I mean. That basically this is constantly in motion, perhaps even more so. And then the idea of the kind of scientia sexualis as opposed to the ars erotica, the erotic arts, is precisely this desire for classification, for terminology, the construction of sexualized subjects, for example, the invention of the homosexual, whether we're talking about perversion, pathology, different modes of sexual behavior. And I think, if you look at a porn site, if you look at a dating app, if you look at kind of how people identify, again, we can see nothing other than this relentless desire to confess, which is the other main aspect of how sexuality is discussed, in the sort of transition from the religious confession to the secular one, in which people are kind of constantly admitting to things, admitting to desires, admitting to feelings, but alongside this kind of infinite proliferation of discourses about sexuality and sex, which is to say, when people say, I identify as X, I'm into Y, my kink is Z, this is exactly what Foucault is talking about. And it's very interesting to think about how I think Foucault is often misunderstood, as you said. This is not, he's not defending this, um, but rather diagnosing it precisely, and to say that it doesn't affirm the idea that we're somehow liberated subjects at all. In fact, these forms of classification may well turn out to be nothing other than they're new forms of capture. And I think if anything we could say about these thinkers, these post 68 French thinkers, they were very, very attentive to the coming forms of lockdown of all kinds, in terms of classification, conceptualization, and they're taking this kind of bigger view outwards and backwards as to how those very categories or categorization itself gets formulated, like what kind of modes of knowledge turn up at certain points in history that then inform the ongoing kind of ever proliferating discourses around precisely sexuality in this case, but pretty much anything we can think of.
Yeah. So, right. I think this whole point about the incitement to discourse is as you were suggesting, is extremely interesting in regard to like the proliferation of sort of Tumblr type sexualities and sexual identities and so on, because it seems that what happens there is that the incitement to discourse, the production of these kind of classifications, which in the way Foucault is describing it, is kind of this expert project of we think of volumes like Kraft Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis, which is essentially a kind of long catalog of different perversions in a sense. And here Foucault, the chapter is titled in English "The Perverse Implantation," which is a great title. But again, it kind of goes along with the idea that this production of discourse is in fact a production of the sexualities. And his most famous example of this, which again I think is sort of weirdly poorly understood, is this idea that homosexuality is not something that pre-exists. And it is, and sort of should remain, quite a controversial idea, right? And it certainly goes against the sort of essentializing modes that dominate sort of liberal thinking on gay rights. That essentially homosexuality is produced through the sort of expert classification of the homosexual, that prior to the coinage of this concept, the homosexual, or there is an act, right, which is the act of sodomy, which can be punished or not. And then there is the classification, which essentially reifies or essentializes the act into an identity, right, into an internal essence, into a psychology that can be endlessly studied and parsed, by psychologists. And this, interestingly, we've moved away from this because there's been a desire to kind of a concern that these types of classifications are are part of a kind of apparatus of stigma. Now, this is exactly the opposite of what Foucault argues, right? That the stigma, the assumption that this is somehow stigmatizing, would be part of this myth of repression, right? That in fact what these classifications do is incite and produce the thing that they're naming and elaborating. And then with sort of Tumblr sexualities, you get a weird, and I argued this in a piece about asexuality in Compact last year, that in fact you get a kind of weird de-essentializing of it, where in fact the discourse itself becomes the thing, right? Simply declaring that you are A, B, or C, but then you may simultaneously declare, but that doesn't mean that I don't also like doing X, Y, or Z. And so, in other words, there can be a kind of detachment of the act from the label and from any inner essence, right? That or that the inner essence is somehow ineffable and inscrutable. And so instead, there are these kind of approximating labels that attempt to capture something of it. And then these can actually be detached from any particular activity or behavior. And so I think that the clearest thing that you see here is the continuation of this incitement to discourse, which seems to take on a life of its own. And also to be kind of democratized, right, in the sense that it becomes something that not that experts impose. And then interestingly, you have like expert bodies will actually take up these definitions that are produced by like 15-year-olds on Tumblr, right, and then give them the kind of imprimatur of expertise. So this whole process certainly I think is a good illustration of the basic insight that Foucault uh, arrives at here, which is that these kinds of that the relationship between like these diagnostic and sort of clinical categories and the behaviors in question is not simply descriptive. It's also not exactly stigmatizing, because it does seem that there's a kind of weird feedback loop between them, by which the act of naming produces things which then feed back into the classificatory schemes, and so on and so forth. So I think it's both one of the most compelling parts of the argument and prescient parts of the argument, and one that I think was oddly he both was heard and also was not, because I don't get the sense that many people who may well have been assigned this book in their intro to gender and sexuality studies classes or whatever, seem particularly conscious of the way that contemporary sort of culture around sexuality has sort of continued to bear out these patterns that he's describing.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think we have to understand Foucault's larger project or meta project as very much a critique of of these tendencies in, to bureaucratize and to classify, and not a kind of embrace of them, but rather pointing to these deeper genealogical shifts in power, and he asks very clearly, like, who benefits from these strategies, like when he talks about the particular groups who are identified in the 18th and 19th century. He talks about the hysterization of women's bodies, the pedagogization of children's sex, a socialization of procreative behavior, and a psychiatrization of perverse pleasure, which is like largely the thing you were talking about um, just now. And I think, all of those things, he's pointing to these broader trends, some of which may have gone up and down. And I think it's very revealing, precisely in the analysis of discourse, that people no longer have to have sex in order to be a particular sexual being, right? Like, this is the interesting thing, right? You can precisely say, I identify as homosexual or queer without ever having had a homosexual encounter, right? Like, and maybe this is, I don't know, is there something interesting here? Like, could there possibly be any such thing as a homosexual who doesn't engage in homosexual behavior? I mean, certainly, I think from the standpoint of a certain concept of the subject, yes, if one identifies in one's essence, and this is precisely the question, and I think this is the trouble that people see in Foucault, is this troubling of the essence, which is why people panic in the face of the idea that everything is socially constructed. This is not exactly what Foucault says, and it isn't exactly what postmodernism says, if we even were to talk in such terms. Um, it's not in a sense that everything is socially constructed, but rather that there is a historical dimension to the social discourse around what, even in that period, or especially in that period, is taken to be the essential truth of humanity. But that's not really quite as catchy. Um, and of course it is destabilizing, and this is Foucault's both genius and what we might blame him for, is this profound destabilizing tactic. That what he really is doing is forcing us to confront what the concept of knowledge itself is, what the concept of power is, that all of our assumptions about how any of those things function are troubled. And we are indeed left in a kind of bereft moment, a moment of kind of epistemic chaos, we might say. And from the left critique point of view, you can absolutely see why this is a problem, because it seems like Foucault is saying we need to not look at class, we need to not look at capital, we need to, and he does say things a little bit like this. Like, he says we can't just talk about, he says we must shift our analysis away from the problem of labor capacity and doubtless abandon the diffuse energetics that underlies the theme of a sexuality repressed for economic reasons, right? So the economic, or the critique of political economy, is not sufficient, right, to explain or to say, we can't simply say, oh, the workers want to repress, I mean, that the bosses want to repress workers, and this would include the repression of their sexuality, or, you know what I mean? Like, certain forms of sexuality or sexual behavior are punished by an economic regime because they're non-profitable, or something like this. I mean, I'm putting a very vulgar sort of quasi-Marxist description of the repressive hypothesis. But it's clear that kind of Marxist approach isn't sufficient, right? Like, if our focus is sexuality, and Foucault is very clear that there is no natural underlying thing, there is no sexual drive that we can point to in an ahistorical manner. That and this again is, we're back to the troubling question of classification. Those classifications, though, of course, don't come from nowhere. They are part and parcel of bourgeois society in this instance, where Foucault begins. He's not talking about feudalism in this book. He's talking about the invention of certain categories, the foremost of which, I think, ultimately maybe more significant, is the question of population, which is where Foucault announces his project of biopolitics um, at the end of this book, which does follow, but does also point to a much bigger understanding, which he then returns to later on, in terms of what happens to societies when population becomes, if you like, the subject of politics. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that shift at the end of the book.
Yeah, so part 5 of volume 1 is the right of death and power over life, and it is where he introduces this notion of biopolitics, which he then particularly goes on to discuss in the lectures that he gives at the Collège de France, which were published in the past decade or two, and which I think we may get into in more detail in a follow up episode. But so he connects, and again, I think Nina, you mentioned that you know to the extent this sort of repressive hypothesis uh, has substance beyond this kind of relatively sort of standard pop narrative of like Victorian repressed sexuality then being overturned by these kind of liberating tendencies. The other narrative that he's calling into question is a kind of Marxian one, as I think you were just suggesting, that basically with the rise of capitalism, there's a need to essentially kind of control the sexual instincts and activities of the workers on the part of the bourgeoisie, and to basically in order to render them more useful and pliable to the functioning of the capitalist machine, right? And so, this is the other version of this argument that he wants to take on, and I think his account of biopolitics is sort of an attempt to revise and offer an alternative to this account. And essentially, the argument is that and this is a through line of several of his works, that there's a shift which more or less coincides with the French Revolution, but begins earlier and sort of culminates in it, from what he calls societies of sovereignty to societies of discipline. And the idea is that societies of sovereignty are in a sense organized more hierarchically through the kind of symbolic power and sort of ritualized power embodied in the figure of the sovereign, of the monarch, right? And in Discipline and Punish, he represents this in a description of a spectacular act of public execution of an attempted regicide, who is sort of brutally tortured publicly and killed as a sort of act of symbolic retribution for having threatened the life of the sovereign, and thus made an attempt on the very sort of basis of power in the state itself. And so that then he contrasts this to the emergence of disciplines like criminology, of these kind of attempts to reform the prison, and use the prison itself as an instrument of reforming the souls of prisoners, of turning them into more well-adjusted subjects of society. And so the idea basically is that this is where you get the shift from a model of power that is more symbolically oriented, hierarchically oriented, and that is essentially centered around the power of life and death exercised by the sovereign, that the sovereign is able to decide on the life and death of the subject, right? Is able to um, declare someone subject to this sort of brutal public execution. And this is precisely what makes them the sovereign, right? Is this kind of monopoly over that power over life and death. And so what he argues in this final section is part of this shift towards what he calls discipline, is a reorientation away from, and here we might think of the simple fact that like the death penalty has been gradually, I mean, certainly its use has been significantly reduced, and it's simply been gradually phased out in many, particularly Western countries. The United States is relatively exceptional in having the death penalty. And what has replaced it? Well, what's replaced it is, I mean, in a sense, the prison, right, which is the focus of Discipline and Punish, but more broadly, a kind of um, a kind of and then the other point that's worth emphasizing here is that executions were public and central, right? That they took place in public places at the center of capital cities, right? Essentially, they were symbolically central to the society itself. Whereas, where do you find prisons? Well, they tend to be, pushed out to kind of outlying regions. Um, so they're not necessarily kind of symbolically important, but they nevertheless function as the means by which, and he one of these books of his lectures is called "Society Must Be Defended," by which society defends itself from the various threats that assail it. And how does it do this? Well, it does it in this more diffuse way, right? It does it through, what he calls a microphysics of power. It does so, sometimes, sort of minor and inscrutable ways rather than central, public, and sort of symbolically invested ways. And so, the point here is that, and so how does this relate to sexuality? Well, the the argument here is that the biopolitics of the population, as he puts it, um, it characterizes a power whose highest function was perhaps no longer to kill, but to invest life through and through. So, this investment of power in life and in the processes of life, of all sorts, right? And in the processes of biological life is, as I understand it, sort of the broader context in which this uh, this sort of incitement to discourse, this kind of classificatory explosion takes place, right? That sort of biological life, the minutiae of which can be, essentially left out of or largely ignored by the operations of power in a society of sovereignty, right? Which is only concerned with these kind of symbolically potent instances in which uh, the exercise of the power over life and death can be put on display. Instead, what you have is a sort of again, a diffuse investment in the life process, the in life itself, and this occurs at every level. And for various reasons, sexuality is, sort of becomes the representative instance of this, or the most crucial instance of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. So it's this sort of transition from visibility and kind of death as the sort of locus of control to life as a kind of regulative principle. And I think this move also to thinking about populations as bodies, as bearers of, I mean, amongst other things, disease. I mean, they're extremely Foucauldian ways we can understand the COVID years. People who have already and were at the time, not least of whom was Agamben in his own unique way, but others were obviously thinking about Foucault's work at that moment as well. But the moment you kind of have population as a object of measurement, or let's say a subject of measurement, we do indeed live in the era of kind of polls and pie charts and stats and uh, voting intention. Everything is kind of measured in this quantitative way through because the political conception of the people is no longer that of the sovereign subject, although in Britain, perversely, we're still subjects to the sovereign, as well as being kind of citizens, because we never had a full revolution, a republican revolution. But in any case, population is undoubtedly the mode of thinking, right? And Foucault makes the point that wars are waged not in the name of a sovereign, but rather in the name of an entire population. And it's in modernity that it's an entire population that is therefore mobilized in order to fight wars. And I think we can see the apex of horror in this conception in the Nazi idea of population, where population control and an image of a healthy population in heavily inverted commas becomes a genocidal machine, because the object of politics becomes the purification of a population, right, and the elimination from a fake scientific point of view of those deemed to be unfit, right? So you have these kind of extremely, I don't know, sort of dark, violent interpretations of a kind of Darwinian, Malthusian sort of conception that is very, very central to modernity. Um, and I think, yeah, so the it's interesting to when Foucault returns to the question of sex in relation to the question of population, it's because sex, of course, has become a political issue, which undoubtedly is correct. Foucault very much wants it not to be a political issue, um, because, as he says, I mean, he points instead to what he calls kind of bodies and pleasure rather than the discourse on sex or sexuality, which is perhaps a little bit weak. We might want to wonder what Foucault is getting at. There, he says at the end, moreover, we need to consider the possibility that one day, perhaps in a different economy of bodies and pleasures, people will no longer quite understand how the ruses of sexuality and the power that sustains its organization were able to subject us to that austere monarchy of sex, so that we became dedicated to the endless task of forcing its secret, of exacting the truest of confessions from a shadow. It's quite similar to his critique of the concept of man, as this kind of figure on the edge of the sand being washed away, if you like that there is this kind of hypothetical world um, in which these sorts of lockdown discourses of power uh, are are truly we're truly liberated from them. And I wonder if Foucault doesn't indeed sort of end up back with a discourse of liberation, even at the same time he's kind of critiquing uh, the dominant discourse of liberation, or the fantasy that the sexual revolution was a type of liberation rather than a kind of reinforcement of classification.
Yeah, so on the sort of population and disease front, it's certainly worth noting how his own, death amid the AIDS pandemic is, it becomes a sort of strange thing to reflect back on during COVID, insofar as, and David Moulton, who's written for us partly on this subject, that the sort of politics of the HIV/AIDS era and its sort of worst moments were, one in which you had this kind of attempt to or this use of it on the part of certain cultural conservatives as a kind of opportunity to re-entrench ideas about the sort of dangers of abandoning traditional morality, in a sense the need to return to a kind of repression, right? And we need to repress these things because this is what happens if we don't. um, and so and that on the sort of population level, you get segments of the population that are sort of stigmatized as like vectors of contagion, or that are seen as in need of being reined in and kind of quarantined to to prevent the generalized pandemic from kind of compromising the population as a whole. So the population as a whole must be protected from these kind of deviants within it, right? And so, obviously, this kind of anticipates some of what happens with COVID, except weirdly, um, as my friend Blake Smith wrote provocatively at the time, like conservatives are the new gays or something, because basically the idea was that, the sort of right wing anti-mask, anti-vax people were suddenly the ones who were sort of, society needed to be defended from, right? The population needed to be protected from the contagion that they threatened to introduce. And so Blake also wrote, kind of about the weird parallels between these two eras, but the way that the sort of at least partisan politics of it seemed to flip. And then you had a really weird kind of, I guess, in the sort of denouement moment of COVID, you had like the weird sort of monkeypox thing where you actually had a few sort of COVID hawk, sort of left wingers basically arguing like, well, we can't tell gay men not to like have orgies because that would be stigmatizing. So we don't want to do that. But these are the same people who argued that like all of society needed to be locked down, right? Except this apparently like one of the essential activities was, having orgies. So I mean that was kind of a weird sort of Foucauldian moment where like um the where I think at least the centrality of sex in a certain sense was reinforced, right? That like, okay, what is sacred? Well, in a sense, non-procreative sex, and only non-procreative sex is sort of the sacred thing that needs to be
Yeah.
protected from repression,
Yeah,
and
there
needs
is
needs to be
that
kind of fostered.
that great
Yeah.
line in Foucault elsewhere where he says that, it's a dead god and sodomy are the boundaries of a new era. Like these are the two things we like have to confront. But this is just to your point. I mean, the sort of sacralization of sodomy as this kind of, apex activity that transcends all other rules that are indeed being enforced by the very same people and socially shamed in everyone else's case, like a heterosexual kiss is worse than a like an orgy between gay men if the former are not wearing their masks. So yeah, I think there is something um perhaps about our era and something to do with this kind of non-procreative sex, but it fits in with, I think, the ongoing fantasy or the illusion of uh the repressive hypothesis, the idea that actually it's only now that we are truly free, that gay men can express themselves in this way, and before it was completely banned, and we're so much better in our era because we not only permit this but we celebrate it, and yeah. Okay, so Geoff, we're coming to the end of Blame Foucault, and I'm just wondering, in all playful seriousness, what you might blame Foucault for on the basis of our rereading of The Will to Knowledge: The History of Sexuality, Volume One.
So I would go back to this power knowledge point and this account of power that you get here as, maybe the thing I would be most inclined to blame him for. And, this, just to quote one more line, power is not something that is acquired, seized, or shared, something that one holds on to or allows to slip away. Power is exercised from innumerable points in the interplay of non egalitarian and mobile relations. So I think, part of what I'd blame him for is at least the way that this becomes used as a kind of, in a sense, sort of ontological basis for certain types of progressive politics, but also for, I'd say, academic politics. And when I wrote this piece about Foucault for American Affairs several years ago, I sort of argued that, part of why I think Foucault was, the most cited thinker in the humanities and social sciences for some time is because he did offer a way for academics to understand, what they were, it's like, okay, if this is true about power, then, my sort of conference presentation to which 8 people show up at, 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning and some dreary hotel is still a kind of contestation of power, and I'm still sort of participating in some sort of struggle. And so I this is maybe a more speculative point. I think on the level of like the way that it becomes the basis for kind of um, weird progressive politics that that endlessly fixates on trivially small interactions and things like that as a basis to cancel people, or as the basis for struggle sessions is one thing. And then maybe a more speculative thing would be that it provides a kind of alibi for this extremely tedious self-importance of academics who are basically minor bureaucrats in this system of sort of institutionalized expertise that I think Foucault does sort of describe the actual functions of quite well a lot of the time, but it does allow them to kind of take up a certain kind of self-valorizing mythology about what they're up to. And so I do sort of, I have to say, I do sort of blame him for that, and I think it does go along with his direct influence, at least in the parts of the humanities I'm familiar with some of the dominant schools of thinking that I think the people who operate in fields that were most influenced by him do seem to be most likely to have this particular sense of themselves and of their own significance. And I wouldn't necessarily say that's exactly what he intended, but I do think he did, or the way these ideas were disseminated did kind of produce these consequences. So that's probably what I'm most inclined to blame him for.
Yes, very good. I agree with that. I think people often read thinkers as instruction manuals and sort of, yes, the narcissistic temptation to imagine uh, that one is sort of engaging in interventions into discourses of power knowledge at every given moment. I think academics would have had this delusion whether Foucault had written or not, but yeah, certainly he provided the language to be, let's say, recoded in exactly the ways you described. So yeah, I think I agree with you about this sort of strange malign influence in this way, unintended or otherwise.
On the other hand, just to say one sort of positive thing to end, just revisiting this text, it did strike me the extent to which it is helpful for thinking about certain things that do get discussed a lot today. If we think about, I mean, I brought up the idea of a kind of, reemergent sex negativity, which we could locate in various areas of the kind of political spectrum and cultural discourse. But also the notion of a sex recession, right? This basic question people are asking of like, okay, so if we've like eliminated all these stigmas and taboos and everybody is supposed to be free and liberated now, like why are people actually not having sex? Why are they in fact young people, like they seem more fixated on like making up these weird neologisms to describe some like internal essence than actually like getting down and dirty and doing it. And then this means on the population level we're like worried about fertility crashing. And so I think like in a sense these problems, or this idea that, for example, how is it that we could have a permissive culture in which all these taboos and stigmas have been eliminated, but people don't want to have sex? Like, does it mean that we were never really liberated? Are we actually still inhibited by some kind of hangover of Victorianism? Like, I think one reason that's worth going back to this text is it really does kind of just undermine the whole basis of even thinking in these terms. Like that in a way, a lot of these questions, if they're just based on a kind of mythic history, or just a fundamental misapprehension of like what sexuality and sex have been in the past couple hundred years, then maybe we can just like brush aside those questions and try to come up with other better ways of thinking about what's actually, because I mean what's happening is certainly weird and does seem to contradict a lot of what we were led to believe, right, about like what would happen when you released the pent up energies of, and
Yes.
like, and so I think the book does, it's certainly worth going back to at this point and saying, okay, like maybe if we just get rid of these these sort of misleading framing narratives and start from a different starting point, we can actually make sense of what the hell is going on.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise we will have to conclude that the discourse on sex is sex, and there is no actual sex. There is only the endless discourse on it, and maybe this is the stage we've reached.
So thanks, Nina. Stimulating conversation as always. And thanks to our listeners. We will be back with a follow-up episode also on Foucault uh, in the coming month or so. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there are various angles and kind of facets of the blame narratives around his work. So there's much more to say. And we will continue building on these points about biopolitics and the population, as well as kind of exploring some of his other contributions, or whether we regard them as positive or malign. So with that, Thanks for listening. Please subscribe on Substack, on your favorite podcast apps. Please subscribe to Compact Magazine at compactmag.com/subscribe. And if you like this show, please give us a rating. And we'll talk to you next time.